or north of the Rhine, which meant that you had this very boggy land with a rainfall of at least 60 or maybe more inches, or let's say about 50 to 60 inches, twice as much as you saw in the Mediterranean. You needed different implements to engage in agriculture. You needed different ways and of functioning economically. You needed technology, which was played down in the ancient world. And at that point, it was very important to undergo what has rightly been called, and it took a long time, the medieval industrial revolution, which was to involve the use of water power, wind power, the development of the roll-board plow, which could cut deep in with a steel share, or not a steel share, an iron share, but even a steel share if they could afford it, and a whole set of new agricultural implements, particularly the use of the horse, which in antiquity simply had a collar and a waistband. The collar strangling the horse's breathing pipe, so that they had to develop a new way of harnessing the horse. This was fundamental. Without that, it was unlikely that you could have had the very significant revolutionary changes that Europe, north of the Alps, and generally certainly north of the Rhine, would have been capable of achieving. All right, I'm going to take a break at this particular point and ask if you have any more questions, and I'll give you a slideshow. Any water around? Oh, thank you.
I just wanted to just get a handle.
Thank you for the correction, by the way.
Okay. Just wanted to get a handle on what we're doing right now, because we spent quite a bit of time on Athens. We're just going to go up through the medieval period to present time.
What I want to show is the emergence of the nation state in contrast to politics, or how it was that the cities began to lose their power after forming very vital forms of city life, in my opinion, not comparable to Athens, and very importantly, establishing remarkable confederations. And the kind of structure they had, and the kind of paideia they had, and the extent and the ways in which the nation-state emerged, which is what we are accustomed to living under today. That is my direction. In other words, my direction is from politics to statecraft. And I'm using historical data to do that, otherwise I can wrap it up in a half hour and we can all go home. But then you'll only be taking my word for it, right? And you won't have a thought-out argument. Agree? Okay, then let's have a good shot of up there, huh? Am I enchanting you? Am I stunning you? Am I bludgeoning you? Am I holding you captive? Because this is your chance to get away.
Yeah, I'm a photographer for the McGill Daily. That's
I can't hear you.
I'm a photographer for the McGill Daily. I think you're going to be interviewed by a writer tomorrow.
Yeah.
I was wondering if I could take a few photographs of you.
Right now I want to drink water, believe me.
You don't have to look for it.
I'm trying to take a break.
Sure.
I need it more than usual, because I'm racing through my subject matter. Could you put it off to one side?
Okay, a couple of minutes break, stretch, jump around, sing.
Which more or less I meant to reinforce the points that I'd like to make, if you don't mind. And I will make observations along the way. I cannot conceivably finish this series of lectures without probably telescoping one of them from 1 hour down to about 20 minutes, and that will be the social ecology of urban, whatever it is I call it. I don't remember everything. Will somebody turn this on, please? Turn the machinery on. You got to turn on the light, and then you got to turn it on to low. First, you're going to turn on. Right. Now you got it, and let's see if it works. But it shouldn't be high, though. You got high, you got low, you got. That's good. The very first one. Now, let's get started. Now, if I sound peremptory, it's not because I'm rude. I'm only rude to my enemies. I'm very rude. But if I sound peremptory, it's because I'm trying to run through this thing with you, and it's almost ridiculous to try to do this in 6 lectures. Well, nothing seems to be happening. How interesting. Now tell me why this is happening, and then I'll be very happy.
Somebody have a reference?
Well, are we on the right? We're not getting it to come forward. Or are we on 0? Is 0 facing the notch? There we are. You have it.
Okay.
This is Athens. It's reconstructed, and I'll focus it for you. This is a remarkable reconstruction of Athens. I wish I could point out its high points. As I indicated, some of the high points are quite obvious because they're high. And up there you see the Acropolis, the Parthenon, and various temples. Over here you see the Panathenaic Way. That was one of the major festivals. You see a crowd moving down there. The center, that square-like empty space, which was not quite entirely empty, is the orchestra of the Agora. Okay? And then afterward, outside the city walls, which you can see ringing the city, notice a great deal of empty space in there. And by the way, that's going to be more characteristic of early cities than we realize. Far from being congested, except where people lived, there was a great deal of empty space within the walls. And on the hillside, the highest point up there next to the Acropolis, on the hillside, forming a slope, is called the Pnyx. And that's where 5,000 or more Athenians, or more precisely people of Attica, convene approximately 7 to 10 days. The arguments are, they called it a prytany, which meant really, for all practical purposes, a tent. And the Greeks divided their political life up into tents. Okay? So a minimum of 10 every 10 days, and then they met quite frequently when they had serious problems, in addition to those 10 days. Now, to move on, you see the city is ostensibly disorganized, but actually it's very organic. People were very eager to live close to each other. And here you see an example of the Athenian, what is it again? That couldn't be Athens, could it? Yeah, Athens' plan of the ancient Agora. And that's already, in my opinion, I think, a Roman version because it's overcrowded. The Romans, like their Forum, which was the equivalent of the Roman Agora, put up so many monuments over there that the citizens couldn't even see each other behind the monuments. And that's what they thought of public life. And here you see the development of the Agora from its very simple form, with its open space, through the Panathenaic Way. Let's see if I can get this. And I'll go through this very quickly. There we are. Now it becomes more and more cluttered, and this is roughly around classical times. Here you see the Roman Forum. The Roman Forum, as reconstructed, these are the ruins, that's the reconstruction, is obviously not the most ideal place in which to gather. It's a wonderful place in which to admire great men. Later on, emperors, initially heroes of the Republic, and every general who had, the money, and most of them did since they looted the provinces, put up statues to themselves, or put up temples in their honor. With the result that the Roman Forum became ultimately, as the Republic came to an end, the sheer farce. It became more like a congested museum with a great deal of agonistic values than expressing the self-aggrandizement of various individuals than it was actually a public meeting place such as the Agora was. Here you see, of course, the Forum again as you know it today. And this is ancient Rome, which tells you all you have to know. That is already megalopolitan. Nothing comparable to the Greek polis. This is already a giant city. You can obviously see the Colosseum right in the middle, and you can see the the area for racing, where they have the chariot races and so on and so forth. And by that time, thank you, the hippodrome. From hippos, horse, and so forth. And that had roughly about 1 million people in it, and at its high point, if you want to call anything about it very high, once the Republic came to an end. And from that particular point on, the city became a very degenerate place, a very decadent place in the next 200 years. As every Roman emperor, particularly the magnificent figure of, what's his name again, the Stoic, can somebody help me please? Well, anyway, he was a Roman emperor.
Marcus Aurelius?
Marcus Aurelius, that's right. Thank you very kindly. As he himself, in his very fatalistic comments, his aphorisms and remarks, or call them what you like, indicates. By the way, the buildings were very shoddy, built by Crassus and his type. They usually collapsed, killing everyone or nearly everyone in them. They often went up as high as 7 stories. The poorest living on top and the more well-to-do living on the bottom. And the place stank because there was very little of a sanitary system among the poor, although there was an excellent one for the well-to-do. Now, this is important, because here you see the primitiveness of the technology that the Romans were prepared to live with and that the ancient world generally was prepared to live with. And what is perhaps most interesting in this particular case are those lamps up there. The lamp that you see on the left is actually an old Stone Age lamp. The lamp you see on the right is a Roman lamp. There was virtually no difference, you know what I mean, in the design and, in anything between these two. The Roman lamp was on the level of a Paleolithic lamp inside a cave. And very little was done in this particular case, to bring things to a more advanced level. They also had very rude pumps for squeezing olives, not pumps. They had a good gearing system, but it was mainly manual labor that they used. Let's see if I can bring it in a little better into focus. The fact that you have human beings, not animals, moving such a sizable system for construction purposes, for structural purposes, gives you an indication of the extent to which they relied on labor rather than on animals to do the work of human beings. Human life was cheap in that world, and it was treated, particularly by the Romans, as cheaply as any people could treat them. That did not mean, however, that they didn't have inventions. There, for example, is a water clock, which they had invented, and which they did not extensively use. Even more striking is that this design is based on a Roman papyrus. They were using papyri at that time, and were just getting into paper. No, they didn't have paper. They were using papyri. That was to come in the Middle Ages. Here they have developed a whole paddle wheel system. Notice that. With a series of gears that could turn the paddle so that they wouldn't need any rowers. And they never used it. They never used it. That's the important fact. What is important not is that they designed it, but it never occurred to them to ever use a mechanism so that that mechanism was actually drawn from a description in Latin rather than from a drawing. Very significantly, they had a harvesting machine, and this was only used in Gaul. It was not used in Italy. And so they used human labor to do the harvesting when they could have had that kind of device using 2 oxen with a harvesting drop over there, essentially functioning like a harvesting machine to harvest their corn, because human labor was cheap and there was no emphasis on technological innovation except for war. This is the most striking of all. You know what that is? Heron's steam engine. They knew the steam engine. And they never used it for any kind of technological purpose except to open temple doors and mystify the masses, or whatever purpose this was here. This is just a re-diagramming of the steam engine. And there you see the steam engine being used to open temple doors, and I may also add to play organs. They never used it for any other prime moving purpose. So don't think for one moment that they were lacking in a knowledge of technology or engineering, although their engineering was not systematic. The point is that labor and life were cheap in that world. That is a true slaveocracy. And here you see the steam engine being used for an organ. Their techniques were extremely simple. This is what they called a kiln on that level. They never really mass-produced. They did mass-produce, but they mass-produced through sweat of your brow vases, which became one of the principal exports of the Greeks, not to speak of the Romans, who generally did not export. Human labor, overwhelmingly human labor, was used to build this enormous network of aqueducts going in every which direction. They also had a very primitive water wheel, which was hardly used in Italy, although it was used, because the river system was that lousy out there, due to the arid weather. This basically was used in Gaul and began to drift up toward Europe. So prime movers were known to them. The steam engine was known to them. The paddle wheel through a gearing system was known to them. A vast number of techniques, metallurgical and otherwise, are known to them, and they never brought them to the service of the economy. A fascinating reality about the nature of that kind of ancient world. And one of the reasons why was that they were not interested in building up technology. They were interested in buying land. That was the real thing. So you got into trade, or you engaged in anything that you could call resembling remotely something like craftspersonship or capitalism for the express purpose of becoming a noble on the land. And therefore, the culture arrested the use of technological innovation for the purposes of capital accumulation, which is the essence of our society today. This development of the simple paddle wheel is one of the great revolutions that was to finally occur in Europe, where Europe was to develop a relatively industrial technology, and particularly a number of natural prime movers. And here you see the movement of peoples into Europe. Germans, Celts, Slavs, and so on. I'm not going to go into the details of that, because we could spend an hour on it. The people initially, the earliest ones, were called Danubian farmers, but that language has now begun to disappear. Essentially, they followed the Danube up, going as far back as well as the 5000 BCE. And there you see different movements from the east into Europe, various tribal peoples beginning to occupy. Now you begin to see the early type of European village. Notice the heavy forest nearby. Notice the palisades. Notice the rudeness of the structure. Let's see if I can get a better focus on that. There we are. The rudeness of the structure. And we begin to see that very Germanic type of world, largely a logged world made up of wood. Wood being essential in the development of the medieval world, both in eliminating the forest, forming log cabins, building log structures. Wood was comparatively rare toward the end of the ancient world because they had basically the forest of most of the Mediterranean. And it was used almost exclusively for furnishing and for making spears, obviously, and warfare. But it was not that common an implement. Stone was still being used as a hammer because it was so costly. Metals were so costly, even though they had developed fairly sophisticated techniques for reducing iron ores. So this kind of new world began to emerge. A heavy-handed, robust world. Notice the plow that they're building. See it? In the foreground. It's a heavy plow that only sturdy people, Northmen, and that type, Celts, people of what the Romans and the Greeks would have called barbarian vintage, would have been using. Heavy duty stuff. Illiterate but muscular. Thumos, as the Greeks would put it. A lot of energy, but as the Greeks would also argue, no brains. I disagree. And here you see the contrasts. Well, I would rather move on, if you don't mind, for several reasons. I put that slide in basically to show the nature of their monumental work. This is typical of their palisaded cities that they developed, villages. And now you begin to see the employment of gearing systems. The use of the water wheel on a very extensive scale. Almost every river in Europe, in fact, almost every viable stream had a water wheel. So already they were doing something that had not been done in the ancient world. They were bringing in mechanical prime movers using water power. And this is the beginning of the medieval industrial revolution that made urban life in the north of the Rhine possible, together with gearing systems. And here you see the different styles of water wheels that they began to develop. The ordinary flat, slat type of water wheel, which was the very oldest, called the undershot water wheel, was limited exclusively to the level of the river. If the river level went down, the water wheel was useless. If the river level went too high, by the way, you had every possibility of flooding a mill that the undershot wheel produced. Then afterward, the undershot wheel moved. Then afterward, you had the overshot, where they streamed the water and learned how to use the water more efficiently, more like a shot out there, and that becomes even more accentuated when you start getting to the last type of horizontal water wheel, where they now have achieved the maximum degree of water wheel efficiency, given the fact that they were locked into a wood type economy. The elaborateness of the gearing system was virtually unknown in this particular case in ancient Rome and then Greece. Here the gears can actually work both ways, merely by pulling. Okay? The water wheel can either serve to reverse the wheel or to bring the wheel, to get the wheel to go clockwise and counterclockwise, making it possible now to do deep shaft mining with a minimum amount of labor. And labor was to be valued at that particular point. Unlike the Roman world or the Greco-Roman world, labor was not cheap in Europe, north of the Rhine. And consequently, mechanical techniques now began to undergo a vast innovation.
Because of the sparse population?
Yes. One of the main reasons, overwhelming reasons, was the sparsity of the population. I will not go through all of this. The next great innovation that was brought in, something which was unknown to both the Greeks and the Romans, was the development of the windmill. The earlier type of windmills are vertical. Notice the shaft was vertical. And the shaft is in a fixed position. So it very much depends upon whether or not you're getting the wind or not. The type of windmill that was developed in the Middle Ages was fundamentally different. As we will see, well, I don't even have an appropriate slide for that because I didn't want to get you all involved in the engineering aspects of that revolution. They had a windmill, a smaller vintage, behind a larger one, so that if the wind changed, the larger sailed the wind axes could go into the wind. In other words, the wind was used on a smaller windmill in the back to shift the change in a rotatable turret, such that the sails of the wind were always kept in the wind. And in that way, they were able to mill on a very large scale. They were able, very importantly, to drain Europe. This was awfully important because a great deal of Europe, north of the Rhine, was bogland. It was heavy mud, owing to the high amount of precipitation. And the third thing was, the Dutch in particular, but in many parts of Europe, they were able to drive back the sea. These ultimately were used not only for milling grain, they were also used not only for a great variety of purposes, mechanical ones as well, including fashioning metals, shaping wood, and whatever you like. They were also used for mining purposes, to drain mines, and to drain bogs, and finally to even drain sea areas of a coastal area where you had a somewhat swampy type land, which thereby revived and brought land into agriculture that was otherwise normally underwater. And here you see a battery of traditional Dutch windmills, and you'll notice, incidentally, the difference in elevation. The sea was once where the cows were, and it was windmills like that that made it possible to redeem the land. Very important, as the third great innovation beside the water wheel and beside the windmill, was ways of harnessing horses. Because the horse is about 7 or 8 times more efficient than oxen. Oxen may look strong to you, but there's a lot of beef and muscle on there that's edible, but not workable. Oxen tire, they move very slowly, and they do a fraction, relatively speaking, of the work that a horse can do, or a team of horses can do. And of course, they would breed horses to be very powerful movers, very powerful agents, animal power, let's put it that way, or horsepower. Now, the way in which the ancients harnessed the horse was basically, notice the arrow, by strangling it. In other words, they put a leather belt around the windpipe of the horse, see? And they put another belt around the waist of the horse. And the horse was obliged, if it had to move anything heavy, to pull so much that the horse would tend to strangle and therefore would rear up and couldn't move further. The revolution in using horses was immense, both for agriculture, for industry, and for everything. Indeed, until the invention of the automobile, the development of the horse collar was one of the most innovative means for trying to engage to travel, besides using boats. And now you see how they did it. Notice how the horse is being strangled up there. Now, excuse me, I want to use another slide. This is not the one that I would like to use. Well, get moving. Can somebody help me? Well, why isn't it moving? I want to show you now the difference that the horse collar meant. No, you passed it. I got to go back.
Take it back.
Now you see the horse collar. Even though the horse is rearing, the horse collar lies on the shoulder blades of the horse, not on the neck. It's also cushioned. And that made it possible now for horses Okay, that made it possible now for horses to carry very heavy loads. Now, it's very hard to tell you how important that was. If you started from the east-west coast trying to go toward Rome, and going through the Roman roads to Rome in ancient times, the price of a commodity would double and treble from the point of origin on the coast up to Rome because of the enormous cost that went into transportation. Transportation was such a problem that even going approximately 150 miles or so could treble, or double at least, the cost of any merchandise that was being imported. Now, with this kind of horse column, transportation throughout Europe became extremely easy by comparison with transportation in the ancient world. Horses could move rapidly. They could go up to speeds of approximately 20 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour, carrying relatively heavy loads, especially if they were bred for hard work. That's point number one. Point number two, and this is extremely revolutionary, notice the way in which the Egyptians on the top are plowing. They're plowing with extremely light plows. Why? Because they only have to scratch the relatively sandy soil. Over here, the small slab-like figures that you see are the impact of a moldboard plow, which goes in from 6 to 8 inches, which is not at all desirable in the Mediterranean, because the sand will simply turn into a big cloud and be blown away by the dust, by the wind. Resembling what the Egyptians were using up there. Can you see the contrast? I'll leave out the rest of the story because I want to get on the move. And what you begin to see now is the development of the moldboard plow. And the moldboard plow was a great big heavy-duty item. I've removed shots, but it's very valuable for you to notice the enormous variety of agricultural, I'm in your way, I'm sorry, the variety of agricultural equipment. Here's the moldboard plow right down here. It's a heavy-duty plow which is no longer simply a branch with a long stick. It has a big slab that turns up, otherwise called the board, the moldboard, which turns up and makes it possible for you to dig in to the soil and thereby deal with the heavy soils of Europe, which were incidentally very, very fertile, just on the basis of rainfall, forgetting about alluvial overflow, the overflow of rivers. You have, in addition to that, a tremendous array of cattle being used not simply for beef or wool, but also being used as work animals, to an extent that did not occur in the ancient world. Notice that in the previous shots of the Egyptians, you actually had people pulling, not that that was the only way in which they did it, but you had people pulling the very thin, scratchy plows for the sandy kind of soil. Now you have these heavy-duty plowing mechanisms, as it were. And here you have, again, ways and means of covering up the furrows so that the seed is now carefully implanted. And then you have, in other words, you also have metal axes, which were largely rare, since metal was hardly developed. Not that metallurgy was hardly developed, since there was a very limited supply of metals owing to the low technology. Metals were often primarily focused toward armor and warfare. Here now, they're used extensively to cut down woods, which were very effective means of beginning to deforest the area and opening it up for agriculture. This kind of array now begins to mark, and notice the metal sickles and other devices that they're using all over the place with a view toward engaging in agriculture that was suitable for Europe. Let me sit down for a while. This was an industrial revolution for all practical purposes. Out of this came the basis for forming the cities. The medieval cities now began, and the most striking feature about the medieval cities is that unlike, and this is Siena if I'm not mistaken, anyway, try to check that, labyrinthine town. Anyway, I'll show you Siena right now, I think. There it is. One of the classics and jewels that remains from the Middle Ages. Give or take the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. Now began these new kinds of humanly scaled towns, walled cities, roughly with populations from about 10 to 20 and finally 30,000. I'm not talking of capital cities, I'm talking of the typical early type Italian city-states. Now, what is remarkable about these city-states? These city-states represented a radical dispensation, where in the ancient world, trade was looked upon as onerous. Craftsmen were regarded as second-rate type people. In fact, Aristotle wanted to exclude them as citizens in his notion of a meritocracy polis, because they were considered to be clients, and therefore were not free people and free agents to vote on their own. They depended upon the custom of their customers and so on and so forth. I won't go into the details of that. You can ask questions about it. In these cities, something new had happened. First of all, what had happened, and this was extremely revolutionary, is that trade, far from being frowned upon, was extolled. The craftsperson was regarded as the jewel of the earth. The Greek had regarded the yeoman farmer as the jewel of the earth, the man who cleared the land of our fathers. He was an ancestral figure, you know what I mean? He was the embodiment of yeoman virtue. Here, in these new European cities, a total revolution had taken place. Trade, far from being frowned upon, was welcomed, and the craftsperson, not the serf, was regarded as being a far more important figure, indeed far more important than even the free farmer, who normally was a tenant. So it was the craftsperson who was now seen as independent, not the farmer. Can you see that difference? Now this laid a groundwork for the development of a commercial world, and a commercial world that was not despised with a view toward buying land someday. It was a commercial world that was increasingly to become an end in itself. But at this particular point, and going well into the 14th century, this commercial world was highly corporate. In this commercial world, craftsmen belonged to guilds. You started out as an apprentice for approximately 7 years. You became a journeyman after being an apprentice working for a master for approximately 4 years, wandering around to pick up trade secrets from other towns. And then you finally had to produce a Meisterwerk. And you know, in the Meistersing, one of the most beautiful examples of Wagnerian music is the song sung by the Meistersinger, the master work. And everyone had to show to the guild, having gone through this 7 and 4 years, 7 years of apprenticeship, 4 years of journeyman, had to show to the guild that he could really produce an accomplished work and could be admitted as a master craftsman. And this didn't make any difference what kind of work you did. If you were a singer, you had to sing for the Singers Guild. And to be admitted, you had to prove that you could compose music and sing music with unusual elegance. Now, needless to say, there was also a guild for prostitutes in some places, like Florence and Milan and a few other places, Padua. And I don't know what you had to do to get into that guild, but that's a separate question. I'm not trying to be sexist. I'm telling you there really was. And they were in the parades. By the way, they were part of the parades that the guilds staged as festivals. And we will see examples of those festivals in a moment. And this was a fundamental innovation. One, a tremendous respect for technology, in contrast to the ancient world which despised it. An attempt to seek labor-saving devices, which in the ancient world were mainly technologies for warfare, not to save labor. An emphasis on trade and craftsmanship, not on yeomanry and owning land. And finally, a tendency or a willingness to reinvest into the industry itself, although there was very little to reinvest into yet. However, wealth now became increasingly stratified. It was not the size of the land or the ancestry that you had which gave you status in the ancient world. Here, it was the amount of money you had. And so landowners, including feudal nobles, and especially the sons of feudal nobles who had very little expectations, since there were too many sons to divide the land among, particularly if you had primogeniture, namely the fact that the older son got all the land, and the younger sons had to go out and sort of fish for themselves, unless their older brother decided to be kind to them. They could always expect that he might shove a knife in there, and they collectively might shove a knife in his back to get the inheritance. At this particular point, you had a situation now where all the values shifted. This was a 180-degree shift in values. And finally, and this is terribly important, you had Christianity. And however much people were exclusionary, and they weren't that exclusionary in the towns because they were always looking for new talent. The famous feature of these medieval towns, although by no means as common as many people think, was that if you were a serf who escaped into a town and lived in the town for a year and a day, you were thereby a townsperson and could not be reclaimed by the lord whose estate or manor you escaped from. And therefore, the Germans put it very well. City air makes for freedom, or city air makes freedom. Okay?
I'm sorry?
Makes free. Now, this was not characteristic of all the towns by any means, but it was a tradition of the towns. So, this marked a tremendous shift, laying the groundwork for an entirely new political and new economic sphere, and also laying the groundwork, as we shall see in the long run, for the emergence of the state. The notion that all these towns were that congested is hogwash. These are fairly recent reconstructions. Let's see if I can get it. It is upside down. I'm terribly sorry. This is Paris. Thank you. You see the Ile-de-France right in the middle. Notre Dame may be there. But the thing that I'm getting at is, notice the walls around Paris. Let's see if I can get at least a better focus on this. Notice the walls. By the way, notice the walls around the walls. You see that? You see the interior wall, which is still around? And then you see the outside countryside, and then you see another wall, which encompasses the exterior wall. And they kept walls within walls for long periods of time until they demolished them. And a great deal of open space existed. Where people lived, they lived very close together. But you didn't have to walk more than a half hour to walk into greenery. I don't mean parks, I mean literally into cultivable land. So that the myth that the medieval towns were nothing but one big sewer, you know, and that everybody lived on top of everyone else was wrong. But people did live on top of each other in one sense, that neighborliness and community and neighborhoods were extremely hypostasized. Here you see Rome. Notice the open spaces. Far from being congested, this is a contemporary reworking with color of what Rome looked like from a distance. It's a magnificent cathedral. I've seen it about half. Huh? No. Now, I forgot the name of the cathedral. I'm sorry. I can't give you everything. And there you see Florence. And here you see the Signoria, the Palace of the Signoria. Now, I want to pause here, because there's a lot to be said. The evolution of that city may be taken almost as a model for the evolution, almost a classical model, in the best sense of the word, and sometimes in the worst, of the evolution of the Italian city-states. First of all, notice that the piazza is of the Signoria, which the Signoria essentially meant, in this particular case, the councilman. And I'm going to have to explain that, because the word councilman underwent various transformations in the evolution of Florence. The Signoria at that particular point is on a human scale. You're not farther away from the very edge of it when you see it. So there were not huge mobs. You did not have an enormous city space. You had something that might have corresponded to the Agora, but on a smaller scale. There you see the David. And that was an area where you would have parades, and I particularly was looking for one which I don't have. Alas, I don't have it. There you see a commune receiving its charm. Now this is very important, and I'd like to sort of close that down and put on the lights again if that's agreeable to you. Can we shut this off and put on the lights? The slides I've shown you up to now have a distinct purpose. First of all, to show the enormous change in values that took place with the evolution of Europe in the northern portions of Italy, particularly what was called Lombardy, or the Kingdom of Lombardy at one particular point. And the second thing is to show you the changes in technology. And the third thing is to show you the change in the character of the cities. Now, I would like, if you don't mind, that we take a few minute break after this and we pick up on this whole theme. May I, please? Yes. And as I pointed out, Europe towns made a complete reversal, which made the European towns much more lasting, because they established a truly urban, and I use the word urban not in urbanization, I use it only in the city foundations. That is to say, they created a city economy, which Rome did not entirely have. Rome's economy was overwhelmingly parasitic, which is not to say there weren't craftsmen in Rome. There were. Which is not to say there weren't craftsmen and trade in Athens. There was. But the reason why these cities, more or less, at least their ancient portions, disappeared so easily is because they did not have solid economic foundations of their own. Very much dependent upon the countryside, very much dependent upon, frankly, tribute. The Delian League that the Athenians established, moving all the money finally from Delos over to or wealth, if you want to call it that, to the Acropolis, was an example of Hellenic parasitism. That is to say, they taxed, and they looked for tributaries to tax. This was not the case with, I'm not saying, there's no such thing as this was never the case. There are many instances where this was the case. But predominantly, the European cities have not based themselves on that. They based themselves not on parasitism. They based themselves on their own internal viability as economic producers. There were certain cities that were more involved in commerce than involved in production. But the German cities in particular, and the Florentine city, Florence in particular, because Florence is not a seagoing, it's an inland city. You see, Venice you can make a strong case for, okay? You can make a strong case for many of the coastal cities that existed. Thank you. You can make a strong case for many of the coastal cities that existed. But it'd be very hard to make that kind of a case for the cities inside the within the Italian peninsula. And their trade, in large part, was not only with Arab countries. They finally were sufficiently un-Christian enough to have dealings with the Muslims, even in the middle of Crusades. That didn't bother them. Business is business, you know what I mean? Not only had dealings with the Mediterranean trade, which they began to open up more and more after the Arabs had closed it for a while. Not as long as Henri Pénard claims it was closed. But very important is that they began to send caravans through the Alps into the German cities, bringing them exotica from Damascus, Baghdad, silk, which they could not get, which came from the east, of course, the caravans, fine steel, which they could not procure in their drafty castles. It was all they could do to make, a fairly polished knife, okay, or make a knight's armor and polish it, and so on and so forth. Jewels that were not seen in Europe, and that could not be seen except through trade from the Mediterranean, coming in from the east. And the short, all that luxury goods, which dazzled those rude, heavy-handed barons, were interested in one way, jousting, which incidentally was a very lethal sport, far from being a sport, more than 1,000 or more lives were claimed in the happy game of jousting, you know? You know what I mean by jousting, folks? When one clashes into the other with a long spear. Seen Robert Taylor do it in Ivanhoe, so what the hell? So this jousting that went on and so on and so forth, you know? By the way, there were small little guys. Did you ever look at their armor? Roughly 4 feet 10, 5 foot tall. That's because they were not well nourished, despite the fact that they were very rugged in other respects, and very warrior in their mentality. Now the point that I'm trying to get is that the city gave that world an economic base that it ordinarily did not have outside of agriculture, and serfdom. And serfdom. Namely, the individual who was sold, his family, land. But land was not alienable. Land theoretically always belonged to the king. It was handed down in trust to various hierarchy of feudal barons, dukes, whatever you like, you know, who were closer to the monarchy, and so on and so forth. But in theory, it was supposed to be the land of the king. But the king usually was confined to next to nothing. And the reality of the situation was that it belonged to the family of various aristocratic lineages. But this land was not alienable, except in England, by the way. There we find out that there was a hell of a lot of alienable land being sold for real estate as early as the 11th century, at a time when land was regarded as too sacred and too ancestral to be sold, much less the property of the monarch. These towns, therefore, had to tear themselves away. And here's the big difference. The towns in northern Europe, or Germany, Amsterdam, northern France, and indeed much of France, and points east and points north, had to tear themselves out of the control of the castellos, or the castles. They had to rip themselves away from baronial control. The towns initially were controlled by bishops. The very earliest towns to be reorganized again on the ruins of older Roman towns, and the newer towns that were created, were generally on the level of bishoprics, okay? The jurisdiction of a bishop, and the bishop generally ran the town. Bit by bit, you began to see a change. And by approximately the 11th century, and even as early as the 10th century, the bishops began to lose control of the towns, okay? In the meantime, remember, feudal lords kept their control of the towns. They regarded them as part of the feudal domain, their domain. And they used the towns for what they were worth and taxed them. So the bishops began to lose control of the towns, but in the course of taking the towns over, they also helped the towns loosen their control, the control that the barons had held over. You know what I'm saying? The church stepped in between the baron and the town and said, we, the church, control this town, not you. And then they began the usual verbal, in other words, jousting with excommunications, turning the cross upside down and everything like that if the bishop didn't obey, if the baron didn't obey, and very frequently the baron yielded. In still other cases, the bishops didn't make any demands, but fit in as functionaries as part of the manorial system of the lords. Can you see this picture? So the earliest towns were basically bishops running the towns, lords controlling the towns directly or indirectly through the bishops, or the bishops controlling the towns completely on their own. It was a mixed bag. Mixed. No uniform thing. Then an interesting thing began to happen. In those towns where the bishops, and they were plentiful, began to control the towns, or have control of the towns, they were kicked out. That is to say, they were pushed back into the church. They were told, stop meddling. Now this was a very unique development. This was a very unique development if you remember that in the ancient Near East, the priesthood had an enormous amount of power. Akhenaten, you'll remember that famous pharaoh, who was the husband of Nefertiti, had his name wiped out everywhere once he died because the priests didn't like his attempt to establish something resembling monotheism. Okay? So the priests had enormous properties and enormous land in the ancient world. And the earliest towns may have been formed around temples, but that's not the point. Here, it was possible to begin to separate the church from secular affairs and religion from secular affairs, which gave a freer area to the movement of commerce. Can you see that? And at the same time, for the towns began to claim their own sovereignty, not only from the bishops, but from the lords, who had been blocked, in some cases, from taking over the towns. Be that as it may, over a period of a century and a half to 2 centuries, the Italian towns in particular began to develop council. Well, you see, I'm trying to use a word translated into English, they used the Roman word consul. The typical Roman official, the consul. And the consuls and councillors, forming councils around them, began to take controls of the towns. And these are the Italian towns, very specifically. And then, very importantly, something happened below the Alps that did not quite occur above the Alps. What happened was that under the consulates, or consulates as they were called at that time, which is roughly from the 11th to the 12th century, and some people in some time can bring it all the way up to the 14th century, and the Italian towns began to force the castles, the lords, to move into the city, to keep an eye on it. That was a major move. Because for once, the town asserted itself over the countryside completely. They began to demolish the castles that were recalcitrant by attacking them and demolishing them, tearing them down. The tearing down of the castles was a very big thing. Or else they left the castles intact and forced and even lured the barons to come in and the nobles to come in and live in the towns. Now this was an extremely revolutionary development at that particular point, because it now established and enhanced the sovereignty of the city over the countryside. Not only had trade done that, not only had an economic base which did not exist by any means to that extent in the ancient world had done that, not only had technology, but on top of that, the very ruling class in the rural areas was brought into the towns and placed under the eye of civic administrations. This happened in Italy. It did not happen in Germany. And I will go into Germany separately, but it happened in Florence. Well, what now began to happen is that once they were in there, that is the barons, living in the towns, they tried to take control of the towns as though they were townsmen. They tried to establish a patriciate, a patrician layer, which they were, well endowed with powers, were endowed with nobility, you know, you toff your cap to them, and you treat them as patricians or nobles. But they were civic nobles. And so they began to fight among themselves with different parts of the city. And this was one of the most amazing developments that happened in the Italian towns. Every one of the nobles began to recreate a huge tower inside a city. In Padua, in Bologna, in Milano, in Venice. Well, not so in Venice. In Milano, in Siena, all these Italian towns, and Florence, they began to establish giant towers in their neighborhood, and one neighborhood would be at war with another, inside the town. Now, two things happened. The first thing is that the town, as it were, became a confederation of neighborhoods, not only because these neighborhoods warred with each other, that obviously was not a confederation, but when they had something in common, like trying to fight the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who wanted to take the towns under his control, they got together, and before long, they would confederate within the towns of the neighborhoods. So you began to see neighborhood government emerging, each neighborhood having its own militia, each one attached to a given patrician, each one with its own guilds linked up with that neighborhood. Now get this magnificent, marvelous, crazy picture. And then afterward, either fighting with each other or combining with each other within one single town. I'm not talking of different cities. I'm talking of one town. Let's take Florence. There they had tower houses. And there were about 20 of them, give or take. And they fought with each other. And so every neighborhood had a very distinct identity. And then they confederated with each other. Finally, the guilds began to get fed up. It was bad for business. You had to go through 5, 10, 15 different customs to go from one part of Florence to another. You had to prove your credentials, you had to show you were not an enemy, that you were just, and then you had to pay a tariff. So what they decided to do was stage a rebellion. The guilds got together, and they staged a rebellion. I'm summarizing my stuff, I might as well throw it away. They staged a rebellion, and they established something that had not existed before. And I'm summarizing this, I'm letting a lot of stuff out, okay? The Capitano del Popolino, or if you want to use something closer to the Latin, the El Capitano, there I go with my Spanish. El Capitano del Popolo, okay, or del Popolino, the captain of the people. And before long, they had a whole bunch of captains of the people, all organized with their own militia, and then another captain of the people to coordinate all the captains of the people. And these captains of the people were now elected by the guilds. So now you began to see, and this was not atypical of most of the northern Italian towns. So that by the 12th century, you now began to see a form of consul government passing into a kind of quasi-military government, which was subsidized by the guilds, ordinary guilds people. And before long, they found that this captain of the people was dangerous, one single captain. So they began to broaden this democracy, if you want to call it a democracy. And before long, the guilds took over completely. And they established guild-controlled government in Florence. Now, what did this mean? It meant that every craftsman was given a sword, okay, was given a spike, was given armor, so that the craftsmen, initially the well-to-do, there were lesser guilds, and there were bigger guilds, smaller guilds and bigger guilds, of big people. The big people were various functionaries, lawyers, blah, 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 you know, the well-off craftsmen, people of commerce, bankers. They began to have bankers at that time by all means, okay? And then on top of that, as they did incidentally in ancient Athens, on top of that they began to bring in the lesser guilds. And before long they had an armed popolo, and they had what was called the government of the people. And they had endless restrictions, which now begins to remind you of ancient Athens. They now consciously, and here you see a revival of a large part of the Athenian democratic spirit or consciousness, but by no means its fulfillment. One, complete limitation of terms. No one was allowed to serve for more than 2 months. They kept on rotating all over the place. Okay? So they finally developed a form of government where nobody could hold office if they held office for more than 2 months, for more than a year. The second thing is, wherever possible, they tried to shorten the terms. They had the right to recall, and above all, they refused to rely on any outside professional military force, which was being offered them all over the place. So they now began to develop a democracy of what you call burghers. Now, this is very important. We talk of bourgeoisie, and what do we mean by bourgeoisie? We mean capitalists. It's very important, in my view, to draw a distinction between a burgher, who's a craftsperson, who is in trade, who is occupied in small-scale trade, and perhaps even a little large-scale trade, and the bourgeoisie. Because the bourgeoisie is built on a heavy industrial and financial base. These are, as it were, this is a class that transcends any given city, and, by the way, is the class par excellence that directly or indirectly is responsible for what we call urbanization. That's the class that knows no limit. These burghers, operating out of guilds, were obliged to answer to the guilds for the quality of the goods they produced, for the training of the workmen that they had, for the prices that they charged, and then in addition to that, had to give their own labor to the building of cathedrals and churches, and the great cathedrals of Europe today, from Chartres to whatever you like, to Notre Dame, were built with the assistance, economically and even the work, volunteer labor of guildsmen, who are not simply concerned with making money. They were also concerned with the beautification of their city, and they took a great deal of, how shall we put it, joy out of a great deal of they were excited by their city. And their city was something to be cherished. It was a jewel. And so they gave their money to it, they gave their labor to it, as well as burghers, making money and engaging in trade, and engaging in production on a craft-like basis. Now that was in the southern part. The same thing happened in the northern part with